event. And yeah, type your questions in the chat and our moderators will keep a track of them. Today's speaker is Mr. Jogendra Nath Kundu. Jogendra is wrapping up his PhD at Video Analytics Lab at CDS Department IISc. He will soon be joining Facebook Reality Labs as a research scientist. He is broadly interested in the areas of self-supervised learning, domain adaptation, and their application to computer vision problems like 3D human pose estimation, semantic segmentation, object recognition, etc. He is a recipient of some of the prestigious PhD fellowships like Wipro PhD Fellowship, Qualcomm Innovation Fellowship, and the Google PhD Fellowship. He has worked as a research intern at Facebook Reality Labs during fall 2021. He has authored several papers in top-tier venues such as CVPR, ICCV, ECCV, NEUR-IPS, AAAI, and WACV. He has also served as a reviewer in several top-tier computer vision and machine learning conferences as well as journals, and has received outstanding reviewer awards at CVPR 2020 and NEUR-IPS 2020. I would now hand over to Mr. Jogendra to continue with the talk.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. So let me share my screen. Yeah, is it visible?
Yeah, yes, it's visible.
Okay.
1 minute. We have a general question and answer rule. If you have any question, you can raise hand or you can put it in the chat box. We'll take at the end.
Sure. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, hello everyone. So I'll start my talk. The title is Self-Supervised Frameworks for 3D Human Pose Estimation. So I'll start with the basic question. Why are we interested in 3D human pose recovery? So one of the key motivation for me is to teach machines to understand how humans move. So we live in a 3D world where we use our body to interact with various objects and for communication with other humans. We are first approaching a society where the intelligent systems and humans would coexist. So I envision that in future, the key factor is going to be about intelligent systems that can perceive, interpret, and interact with humans in the 3D world. So in this talk, I'll focus on the first key step, that is perceiving 3D human pose. So an effective pose estimation system finds application in a wide range of industries. For example, in movies, animation industry, sports analytics, physiotherapy, and AR/VR applications, military exoskeleton applications, etc. Our fundamental goal is to recover a 3D human pose representation at the output with some form of 2D representation as input. Based on this representation, the problem may become easier or more difficult. So in the 2D domain, the first representation is the raw input images. But it is difficult to extract 3D pose from raw RGB images. Certain works rely on 2D key points as the input 2D representation. So human pose is commonly defined as a way of representing the location of human skeleton joints, and the 2D key points represent the 2D pose. XY represents the relative pixel location, while Z represents the 3D depth. Further, more sophisticated 3D representation of human include 3D parametric models or 3D volume. So while parametric 3D captures the rough body shape, volumetric representations capture detailed clothing fidelities, as shown in the figure. So in this talk, I'll be focusing on extracting of 3D key points and parametric models from the raw monocular RGB images. This is one of the most challenging and high-level tasks under 3D human pose estimation. Now we dive deep into how to use deep learning to solve this 3D pose recovery problem. With the advent of powerful convolutional neural networks, deep learning has been super successful across a range of vision tasks. What are the key ingredients for a successful deep learning based solution? First is a millions of level data, and second is a reasonable deep architecture. Upon availing this, supervised 3D pose learning can be posed as a simple regression problem, where the CNN takes in the monocular image to regress a form of 3D pose representation, which could be the 3D pose or the shape or the colored mesh representation. However, annotated data is not always readily available for such complex 3D tasks. So what are the prime challenges? Broadly, there are two different ways to capture 3D pose ground truth. First is a multi-camera structure from motion setup, and second is via some body-owned sensors as shown in the figure. So both the systems rely on calibrated infrastructures and hence are usually done in an in-studio environments. Such systems are difficult to configure in outdoors. So this often restricts the diversity in the limited apparel and background variations. Notice the discrepancy in diversity between the leveled in studio and the unleveled in the wild samples as shown below. Thus, a model trained on such in studio samples fails miserably when tested on in the wild samples shown on the right. So to circumvent this problem, weakly supervised approaches have been proposed. These usually require access to some auxiliary supervision such as 2D pose annotation, multi-view pairs, or silhouette annotations. However, strong reliance on annotation-driven learning limits generalization, resulting in poor cross-dataset performance. Such solutions are error-prone and are not easily scalable. For instance, given the transient nature of human fashion, the visual appearance of human attire keeps evolving. This demands such approaches to periodically update their 2D pose dataset in order to retain their functionality, which is highly cost inefficient. So addressing these, we propose a self-supervised approach that is free from any paired supervision or auxiliary 3D cues such as multi-view or depth. So as babies, we learn how the world works largely by observation. A working hypothesis is that generalized knowledge about the world or common sense forms a bulk of biological intelligence. This common sense ability is taken for granted but has remained an open challenge in AI research since its inception. So we'll see how a common sense based learning objective can solve this 3D pose recovery problem. So this talk is divided into three parts. I'll start with the first part, which is titled as Self-Supervised 3D Mesh Recovery. This work was published in ECCB 2020 as an oral presentation. So here I will discuss about the problem setting. So in the proposed setting, we consider access to the following. First, a data set of wild videos from YouTube depicting actions of a single person. Second, a parameterized human body model that factorizes the 3D human mesh into low-dimensional shape and pose parameters. And finally, we consider access to a pool of unpaired 3D pose skeletons to impose a plausibility constraint on the predicted 3D pose representations. Later, I'll show how these data forms are used to develop an effective self-supervised learning framework. So to devise a self-supervised objective, we draw motivations from works that aim to disentangle the fundamental factors of variations in human-centric images. So these factors are the 3D pose, the foreground appearance, and the background appearance, as shown in the figure. Here, we leverage the full advantage of incorporating a parametric human model in our framework. The parametric SMPL model not only encapsulates the pose, but also segregates the foreground from background, which is obtained via the projection of the 3D mesh onto the image, as shown in the figure. The problem boils down to a faithful registration of the 3D mesh onto the image plane, or in other words, disentangling the foreground from background. So to devise a self-supervised objective, we draw motivation from the concept of co-saliency detection. So in co-saliency detection, the objective is to segment out the common salient foreground from a set of two or more images. In the left, we saw image pairs from an in-studio camera feed. The two images depict diverse poses of the same person, but in homogeneous background. Thus, it is not suitable for co-saliency detection. Whereas, in the right, the image pairs from the wild videos depict the same person in diverse pose and also diverse background. Thus, the commonness of foreground becomes distinctly salient in relatively diverse background as a result of substantial camera movements. Such pairs are sampled from wild videos, which are abundantly available on the internet. So to create the dataset of image pairs, we leverage large-scale in-the-wild videos of humans. So we sample pairs of frames from these videos, maintaining a considerable temporal gap, as shown by the dotted lines. Using an off-the-shelf detector, we crop out the human in the foreground and compute background diversity metric by computing the background regions, by comparing the background regions with each other. So following this, we choose the pairs having background diversity metric greater than a particular threshold to create the required dataset with diverse background, as shown on the right. So we adopt a novel self-supervised training paradigm, as shown on the right. So for a given image pair, we pass them through two parallel colored mesh prediction pathways. The commonness of foreground appearance allows us to impose an appearance consistency loss between the predicted colored mesh representations. So the key idea is that the common sense inspired appearance consistency loss should be able to guide the model to recover the corresponding 3D pose in the intermediate representation. So for effective use of this approach, one of the key challenges is to avoid degenerate solutions. Is an impossible pose because of the knee bend. The knee bend is entirely impossible. So a natural question arises is how to solve this problem. So we take inspiration from humans. So humans are able to reasonably estimate 3D pose from monocular images based on past experience of seeing how humans move or interact in the 3D world. That is based on the prior knowledge. So we seek to constrain the output space to only plausible poses by developing effective ways to instill this prior knowledge. So next we'll discuss how this prior knowledge can be incorporated into the CNN framework. So to recap, the input image is sampled from unpaired wild videos, and we also access unpaired 3D pose data. So note that there is no paired annotations in this case. So in the proposed network, we first employ a CNN regressor to obtain the camera and the parameters of the SMPL model, that is the shape, the pose, and the camera parameters for the given input image. The human mesh model uses these parameters to output the deformed mesh vertex locations as shown on the right. The shape parameter beta is a low-dimensional PCA-like coefficient obtained from 3D body scans. The pose theta consists of 23 joint rotations describing the articulations of a body joint. The shape parameters incorporates the prior knowledge on how a human body shape looks like, and pose parameters incorporates the prior knowledge about the human kinematic structure. However, the joint angles are not yet consistent to ensure the plausible poses. So we realize this via an adversarial autoencoder, which is trained to generate plausible 3D human poses. So we constrained the latent to follow a 32-dimensional uniform latent distribution in the range -1 to 1 as shown as phi. So following this, we use the same Trojan decoder of the base model into the CNN framework as shown in the figure. So note that a simple Tannis nonlinearity on the pose prediction edge phi a would restrict the model to generate plausible poses in this particular framework. So this solution turns out to be very effective against deploying an adversarial discriminator, which often leads to optimization issues. So following this, we propose a novel way of inferring mesh texture, where the network's burden to regress vertex color or any sort of appearance representation is entirely taken away. So we realize this via a differentiable color recovery module. So the prime functionality of this module is to assign color to the 3D mesh vertices based on the corresponding image space coordinates which are obtained via camera projection. However, this requires us to effectively address the challenges of mesh vertex visibility in the appropriate camera view. We utilize vertex normal directions and vertex depth to effectively select only the camera visible vertices for reliable color assignment. The output of this test is represented as a partial color C tilde. Further, to obtain a fully colored mesh, we use a predefined four-way symmetry grouping, which propagates the color from the camera visible vertices to the non-visible ones. And finally, this outputs a fully colored mesh representation without requiring any additional multi-view or temporal cue. So now, for a given image pair IA and IB, we pass them through the two parallel pathways of the network, followed by imposition of appearance consistency as shown in the figure. So additionally, to regularize the self-supervised framework, we also impose a sub-consistency loss alongside the fusion of 3D pose prior, which is discussed before. Note that at test time, we perform single image inference similar to prior regression based approaches. So additionally, we also impose a part prototype consistency. So as compared to enforcing consistency on raw color intensities, the part prototype consistency aims to match high-level perceptual features that is robust to illumination changes. So this is achieved by applying color recovery on convolutional features after forwarding the image through a pre-trained VGG network as shown on the top. So moving on to the experiments, we perform quantitative comparison on two standard datasets. We demonstrate superior weakly supervised performance while accessing either 2D pose or multi-view information as auxiliary supervision. Semi-supervised variants achieve state-of-the-art performance against the prior model-based approaches while accessing consistent supervision. Here we saw 3D visualizations generated by our framework on samples from wild YouTube videos, followed by a cross-pose transfer. So basically, we transfer the pose inferred from the person on the right to the colored mesh estimated from the person on the left and vice versa. So this highlights a new use case of the proposed colored mesh recovery architecture. Further highlight our diverse applicability. We perform part conditioned appearance transfer. So on the left, we show the target images whose pose and shape are combined with the selective part appearances recovered from the source image shown on the left. So for instance, in the first row, the synthesized image depicts upper body apparel of the person in the source image combined with the lower body apparel of the person from the target. That's on the top. So in summary, we propose self-supervised learning frameworks which not only infers pose and shape but also yields colored mesh as a byproduct. So in contrast to general trend, our color recovery module eliminates the network's burden to regress an explicit appearance-based representation. The proposed framework promises an unified solution for a variety of human-centric tasks, which is beyond the primary task of human mesh recovery. Yeah, so this ends the first part of this talk. So maybe I can take some questions if there is any. I can move to the next part. You can take it at the end.
If any question is there, you can just raise hand and open your mic. I think we have no
Yeah,
question.
I think, yeah, I can move to
Take at the end if some.
Sure. Okay, so next I'll talk about our work on adaptation via relation distillation. So this work was published in NeurIPS 2021. So in this work, we posit the problem as a domain adaptation framework. So the prime objective is to transfer the task knowledge from a labeled source domain to an unlabeled target domain. So on the left, we saw possible labeled source datasets, which are synthetic serial dataset or some in-studio human 3.6 dataset. And following this, one can train a fully supervised source model as shown in the figure. However, upon deploying the source trained model to different target environments, the models perform suboptimally, thus requiring an effective adaptation training strategy. On the right side, we list target level requirements in decreasing order of supervision levels. And one must minimize the target level requirements for convenient deployment to in the wild scenarios. Hence, in this work, we seek to achieve unsupervised domain adaptation, where we do not access any levels from the target domain. So to this end, cast the 3D learning as a self-supervised adaptation problem. So in a nutshell, we aim to transfer the task knowledge from a labeled source domain to a completely unlabeled target. So in the proposed setting, we consider access to the following. First, a labeled source dataset, either a synthetic serial or an in-studio human 3.6 environment. While the synthetic data suffers from huge domain gap, and in-studio data consists of limited diversity in terms of pose and background variations. Next is a dataset of unpaired 3D pose sequences from a motion capture dataset. This is used to constrain the predicted pose to follow the real pose distributions, as used also in the previous work. A dataset of unlabeled video sequences from the target domain. Notice the extent of domain gap between the source and the target dataset. So here we introduce the datasets and modules involved in this pipeline. So we introduce the notations of the three different datasets. First is a labeled source dataset DS, where XS and YS denotes a tuple of source image pair with its 3D pose annotation. Second, a set of unpaired 3D pose sequences, Y tilde. Individual frames of sequences gives us dataset of unpaired 3D poses, which is represented by Y. And below we saw a set of unlabeled video sequences from the target domain represented by X. So following this, we introduce two latent embeddings, that is a pose embedding and a motion embedding. Here the pose embedding Z is realized as a latent embedding of an adversarial autoencoder, which is trained on the unpaired 3D pose samples Y. So this is similar to the adversarial autoencoder training in the previous work. Next, we also train the motion embedding V, which is learned as a latent embedding of a recurrent autoencoder that operates on the sequence of pose embeddings. So following this, the image to pose inference is carried out by two explicit mappings, that is the image to latent and the latent to pose. Note that the latent to pose mapping DP is a pre-learned pose decoder, which is taken from the adversarial autoencoder learned before. So here GS represents the source specific image to latent mapping, which is obtained via supervised training on the labeled dataset DS. After obtaining all the discussed pre-learned modules, our prime objective is to train or adapt the target specific image to latent mapping G on the unlabeled target domain samples. So initialize G from GS and DP is kept frozen from the adversarial autoencoder training as shown in the. So introduce relation distillation as a means to align unpaired cross-modal samples, that is the unpaired target videos and unpaired 3D pose sequences. A relation can be characterized as a lower order or an higher order relation based on the number of entities that participate in defining a relation tuple. For instance, in contrastive learning, a pose space triplet relation expresses a coupling of just 3 pose entities, that is an anchor pose obtained from the input image, the corresponding positive pose obtained from the pose invariant image augmentation, and a negative as a completely different pose. So this is thus considered a lower order relation. However, a similar contrastive triplet defined in the hierarchical motion space, that is, in the temporal pose sequence of the fixed length sequence T, would couple 3T number of pose sequences. Thus is considered a higher order relation. So an intuitive question is why to use motion embedding when the goal task is to realize image to pose mappings. So the hierarchical motion embedding facilitates a suitable platform to formalize temporally structured higher order relations, associations of the pose entities. So we'll see how it is being used in the further slides. So unlike positive coupling of in general contrastive learning literature, we introduce non-local relations that couple entities beyond the structural neighborhood. So note that general contrastive learning approaches use pose invariant augmentations as shown above, whereas we formulate pose varying long range relations, which are named as non-local relations. We next saw a few examples of non-local relations defined in the pose and motion space. So for pose space, we have pose flip, where we flip the image horizontally. A similar pose space transformation would involve swapping the left side joints with the right side joints, because if you notice, the pose also changes with this particular augmentation. In plane rotation, where we rotate the image by a certain angle theta, let's say 50 degree. And flip plus in plane involves a horizontal flipping followed by an in-plane rotation. And similarly, in the motion space, we have only flip, where we flip each image in the frame in the sequence horizontally. Flip backward, which is obtained by reversal or backward of the individual flipped frames. And then only backward, which is obtained by reversal of the individual frames. And slow backward, which is constructed by sampling the original sequence at 15 fps to enable a temporally slow 30 fps slow backward video taken from the middle region. And similarly, a fast forward variant is constructed by sampling the original sequence at 60 fps to enable a temporally fast 30 fps fast forward video. We observed that adapting an image to latent mapper G based on the contrastive relations results in poor pose estimation performance. So this is because the positive coupling in contrastive based relations is limited to local neighborhood, as here the positive counterparts of an anchor is obtained via simple pose invariant augmentations. So to this end, our goal is to come up with a new set of relational associations with non-local positive couplings. This aims to characterize long-range pose relations, that is, a positive coupling of two entities that are grounded far apart from each other. So if you look at the ZT and ZT plus, which are very close under C, and the distance between ZT and ZT plus is far away in the figure in under D. So thus propose to distill non-local relations via pre-learned relation transformer networks. So relation transformer networks operate on the pose and motion space, and these are basically fully connected neural networks represented by TZ RZ for the pose space and TV RV in the motion space. So here RZ and RV denote the independent embedding specific rule IDs. So RZ may represent pose flip and RV may represent fast forward, for instance. So we define tangible non-local relations separately in the pose and motion space that are categorized under lower order and higher order based on whether it is defined in the pose space or in the motion space. So the relational energies aim to preserve the equivalence of higher order spatiotemporal relations between the two modalities as a means to perform cross-modal alignment. So more concretely, so given an input sequence, we first obtain its image space transformation for the given non-local relation, such as, let's say, flip backward. We then obtain the corresponding motion embeddings V and V plus through the image to latent model followed by the recurrent motion encoder. In the motion space, the relation transformer network TVRV is used to predict the embedding corresponding to V plus, which is denoted as V plus hat. And finally, we impose equivariance consistency loss, LVRV, as shown in the figure. So this loss is regarded as the non-local relational energy loss, as shown on the right. So next, we put forward a trivial question. What makes non-local relations more effective over the general contrastive relations? So we hypothesized that relations coupling diverse samples or long-range interactions lead to a better cross-modal alignment. So to evaluate this hypothesis, we define a distance metric to apprehend the extent of non-localness of individual relations, which is termed as latent distance. So figure A shows a grid interpolation of pose embedding and a bar plot comparing relations. Clearly highlights the gap in the degree of non-localness between the pose flip and in-plane rotation. So this supports our observation of negligible performance improvement when using local relations on top of non-local relations. Figure B shows grid interpolation of speed of the generated motion with latent distance bar plot comparing the non-local motion relations. So we perform a similar metric analysis to select the best set of relations defined in the motion space. Finally, in figure C, we show a 2D PCA projected motion embedding points with the glances of the anchor video in the middle point and the corresponding transformed videos obtained by operating over various motion related non-local relation candidates such as only flip, flip backward, only backward, slow backward, etc. So note that only the relations in blue are selected because of their high non-localness. So in a nutshell, we propose a cross-modal alignment technique to align the learned representations from the two modalities. So moving on to the results. So we prepare our S2H that uses a synthetic surreal dataset as the source and unpaired human 3.6 dataset as the target. So we perform a thorough analysis on the standard human 3.6 dataset to compare our performance against the prior state-of-the-art methods. So when compared to prior unsupervised approaches, our S2S achieves state-of-the-art performance on human 3.6 tested. We also outperform prior arts, which uses additional in-house data. Next, we show our performance in a semi-supervised setting. Our S2H semi, which uses target adaptation supervision on a small subset of labeled samples, outperforms several semi-supervised prior arts. We even outperform Iqbal et al., who uses multi-view supervision and labeled MPI datasets for semi-supervised results. Lastly, when evaluated on 3DPW dataset, our S2W, which uses synthetic surreal data as the source and in-house web dataset as the target, yields performance comparable to the prior arts without any supervision on the real data. Whereas our SH2W outperforms the prior arts by a significant margin, with a PA-MPJP of 72.1 as highlighted in the table. I'll skip this slide. So moving on to the qualitative results, our model yields accurate poses on 3DPW dataset, the LSP dataset, and the web dataset. So this demonstrates the generalizability of our model to in the wild scenarios with just in studio or synthetic supervision. However, it is to be noted that the model can produce outputs with considerable error in case of rare athletic or complex athletic poses. So in summary, we presented a cross-modal alignment technique to align the learned representations from two diverse modalities of images and poses. The described higher order relations operating in the motion space couple many entities, resulting in a better cross-modal alignment compared to the general contrastive relations. So unlike general contrastive learning, Our non-local relations couple entities beyond the structural neighborhood, which results in a further improvement in the adaptation performance, yielding state-of-the-art results on various datasets. And finally, we provide an objective metric, the latent distance, in order to select the most effective relation set for adaptation to on-level targets. So that ends the second part. So finally, I'll talk about the last part, which is titled as the uncertainty aware adaptation for 3D human pose estimation. So this work is accepted for presentation in CVPR 2022. So here we seek to address the practical deployment related challenges while instilling such systems for various real world applications. So consider a scenario where we want to deploy a 3D human pose estimation system in a new application environment. So for a vendor's perspective, a general approach would be to improve the system's generalization by supervised learning on a wide variety of leveled in-house data. However, target-specific training usually achieves the best performance beyond generic systems. What are the desirable traits of a deployment-friendly pose estimation framework? So let us consider a scenario where the target environment is identical to the source domain, implying no domain shift. So here the vendor can choose to directly deploy the generic system without adaptation training. However, the system must have a provision to detect whether it is required to run the adaptation process. In other words, it should have the ability to discern auto distribution samples. Similarly, in the scenario 2, that is, in the presence of reasonable domain shift between the input source and the output target, the required trait will be the first, the over detection capability, and second is an adaptation algorithm. Similarly, in scenario 3, that is, in the presence of a significant domain shift where the target domain includes occluded humans or non-human images. So here the over detection ability must be retained even after the adaptation in order to be able to reject images of non-human images. So we'll get into more details in the further slides. So available networks often behave erratically in the absence of any provision to discard unfamiliar out of distribution data. To this end, we plan to implement a self-adaptive pose estimation model with instilled uncertainty estimation capability. So the pose predictions of such networks must be associated with a measure of uncertainty barometer as shown on the right. So note that the uncertainty is maximum for the second non-human image, while indicating that the through model outputs a pose, so this indicates that though the model outputs a pose, it is not confident about the prediction. So to enable uncertainty estimation, we propose a novel multi-representation pose network, which is denoted as MRPN. So it constitutes a common deep network backbone, which is E, with two output heads subscribing to two diverse configurations. So the top head, BL, incorporates a localization-based representation. So it employs fully convolutional architecture where the final pose is realized by a heat map-based spatial PDFs, as shown in the figure. So such model-free design does not allow to inculcate structural articulations and bone length priors, which is a major shortcoming for such representations. On the other hand, the bottom head, BR, incorporates a regression-based representation. So it employs fully connected layers after the backbone CNN, thereby breaking away from the spatial structure to learn a highly nonlinear mapping to directly regress the 3D joint coordinates or a parametric pose representation. So unlike the localization-based design, one can easily inculcate joint connectivity and bone length priors via model-based design with integrated forward kinematics, as shown in the figure below. However, such model-based representation does not allow a provision to extract joint level uncertainties as it sees the pose as a whole. So following this, the pose uncertainty is quantified as the disagreement in pose prediction obtained from the two output heads, subscribing towards two diverse design configurations. So the pose uncertainty U of I measures the L1 distance between the Q tilde and Q hat as shown in the figure. So here Q tilde is obtained by taking soft argmax over the heat map output of BL, and similarly Q hat is obtained from the scaled orthographic transprojection TC of the 3D pose predicted by BR. So next we formalize the joint level uncertainty H of Ij. So here I is the image and J is the joint ID. So as discussed before, joint uncertainty is extracted as the self entropy of spatial heat map distributions obtained by the localization branch BL. Following this, the adaptation process accesses three different datasets. First, a labeled source data DS. Second, a dataset of background images DB to approximate an extreme out of distribution scenario. And third, the unlabeled target dataset DT. So following this, the adaptation process can be understood through the pose uncertainty histogram. So in the pre-adaptation stage, we plan to enforce the desired behavior by maximizing U for the background while minimizing it for the source. Upon encountering the unlabeled target data, the adaptation process seeks to reduce the target uncertainties alongside a progressive self-training on a set of reliable pseudo-levels. So note that the histogram of target uncertainties slide towards the source, implying the model now treats the target as in-domain samples. So by forming such self-supervised objectives, we're able to perform target adaptation without having access to any target levels. So we interpreted the behavior of our network for a range of in-distribution and out-of-distribution samples. So we saw 5 different examples. So on the right panel, we noticed that to maximize pose uncertainty for backgrounds, MRPN estimates 2D landmarks and 3D pose points separated towards opposite diagonal corners. Here, the 2D landmarks are collapsed to a top left corner, whereas the root joint of the pelvis for the model-based 3D prediction seem to have collapsed towards the rightmost column, toward the bottom right corner. So on the bottom panel, for uncertainty target instances, we see 2 peaks in the joint heat map PDFs. One on the top left corner, that is the OD related, and the other near the actual joint location. So during adaptation, the OD related peak suppresses while the joint related peak rises to simultaneously reduce the uncertainty while converging towards the true pose outcomes. So on the left, the joint level uncertainty for samples close to the source domain is indicated by the entropy of the heat map PDF. So moving on to the experiments, on the human 3.6 dataset, MRPN outperforms prior-arts across various levels of supervision, so which achieve state-of-the-art results with a PAMPJP of 49.6 mm, which is lower the better, in a semi-supervised setting. We also perform our prior work without leveraging any in-the-wild samples, despite the huge domain gap between the synthetic source and the in-studio target datasets. So MRPN PU works on images with full body visibility. So the pose predictions in the first column shows the estimated pose alongside the uncertainty barometer as discussed before. So notice the high uncertainty for the last 2 rows with partial body visibility as compared to the same for the first 2 rows. So quantifying joint uncertainty enables our adaptation to work on in-the-wild target domains even in the presence of external occlusion or truncated frame scenarios as shown below. So on the right, we see results where the bubble size indicates joint uncertainty similar to the barometer discussed before. Notice that the bubble size appears for the out of view joints and gets bigger for certain joints, indicating high joint level uncertainty. So an effective real-time adaptation algorithm can allow us to extend our framework for continually changing environments. For example, a supervised synthetic trained model adapted to sunny weather conditions would require automatic real-time adaptation upon encountering a rainy weather situation without any manual intervention. So in summary, we presented a multi-representation pose network that embraces the pros and cons of both model-free and the model-based pose representations to realize a disagreement-based pose uncertainty metric. We utilize negative samples such as background images and simulated joint level occlusions to improve uncertainty estimation capability, which is retained even during the self-adaptation process. We saw better generalization to both full body in the wild samples and also for the challenging partial body visibility scenarios. So this ends the last part. So let me conclude this talk with some interesting problems. So while we aim to develop intelligent systems that can perceive, interpret, and interact with humans in 3D, most of the current success has been predominantly towards perceiving 3D pose from RGB images. So moving forward, in order to better interpret and interact, we have to enable machines to understand complex human object or human-human interactions. So very recently, new datasets and custom neural architectures have been developed to enable such high-level tasks. Several such datasets are developed in a laboratory environment or in graphical simulation environments. As such, setups provide error-free, clean annotations. So it is interesting to explore what kind of common sense-based self-supervised learning would work well for such complex interaction-based tasks. Improving robustness of such models remains an open problem. So with this, I would like to conclude my talk. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we can take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Yogendra, for this very informative talk about self-supervised learning and its application in computer vision. Please ask any questions if you all have any questions. Yeah, Rajesh Kumar.
Hello, is it audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. It's a wonderful session. So my question is somewhat relevant to OpenSync. So how we can connect the for this question?
Your voice is not so clear.
Yeah, it's
yeah. Is it audible, right?
No? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So how we can incorporate this 3D pose estimation with the OpenSync?
Okay, OpenSync, like, can you give some example?
It is the biomechanical simulation tool developed by the Stanford University. So with that, we can extract the kinetics and kinematics and muscle all information. So with respect to the 3D pose estimation, how we can model these things? Maybe just if you have an idea, you can.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the system. Okay. So is it like a image based? Like in our case, the main goal is like, can we extract 3D pose from raw RGB images?
Okay.
Or are they like using some sensors or some sort of?
No. It's like a It's like a image based also, but 3D and the real world kinematic data we can incorporate into the software.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not really aware of.
Okay. No issues. Yeah. It's a really wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rajesh. Any other questions?
Hello.
Yeah.
So like I have a question, like the poses that you are detecting, is it for a single person in a image, or like there are also you have tested your like work with multiple person in a frame? Because like if you are feeding the constant of like joint bone length in form of graph or whatever, so if there are multiple person and like let's say one is children and one is adult, so different diversity of bone length in a single image, that kind of constant, is it like have you done this kind of
Yeah,
experiment?
so like the works that I talked about today are predominantly single person. So we considered like there's a detector which is separating individual persons, and then you are just processing that detected person. And so there are some works. I have also done some work on multi-person pose estimation. So there the approach is slightly different. So like when you say bone length, like usually like if we see like the relative bone length is always constant, but the scale may vary, like for a children versus an adult. Right?
Yeah, but
So
yeah, if we are doing that like cropping one person at a time and then detecting, then it's okay. But
then
yeah,
it's okay.
if there are like want to detect, let's say in this photo which is in the scene now, like there are three players in,
Yes.
so detecting them, and if they are one is children and one is adult, then I think there will be some like problem.
Yes, yes.
If we do
So
it.
there is an inherent sort of ambiguity. Like if there's a child, like so is the child looking small because he is far away from the camera, or is it because he's a child, like because of his height?
Yeah.
So
Got
that
it.
ambiguity
Got
is
it.
always there, and I think that also remains in even most of the state-of-the-art multi-person approaches.
Maybe first like finding out the cropping the person particularly by placing an anchor, and then doing per person pose estimation is okay, I think.
No, I think like this is an inherent ambiguity. So even purpose like single image you cannot really do. So if you have like a video, so like some frames before that frame and some frames after that frame, that you can use. That can give us information whether the guy is looking small because his height is small, or is he because it's away from the camera. So you need
Okay.
extra information to sort of rule
Okay,
out that.
thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Sumit.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes.
I think it's about your first part of the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
You said that you extract the camera parameters from the image. So can I know which kind of parameters they are? Are they intrinsic or extrinsic?
So these are
Or
extrinsic parameters.
okay, so
Yeah.
you use some supervised data for doing that?
For the camera estimation, no,
Yes.
not exactly. So we have two variants. We have a fully unsupervised variant, and then there is a semi-supervised variant. So in the semi-supervised, we actually train the base model on human 3 points, like in studio data, and show results in the wild by doing sort of self-supervision. So there it gets supervision, but on a constrained data like synthetic or in studio. So that is one part, but in the fully unsupervised case, it actually doesn't get any supervision. So the appearance consistency, those kind of losses only has to drive the entire pipeline.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions? I guess there are no further questions.
Okay.
I guess it was a very wonderful talk again, and thank you, Joginder, for
Thank you.
as the time. And
Can we have the slides or the recording online?
yeah,
recording will be available in the same chat, like same this for 30 days.
Okay,
and
that's good.
Same this, and we'll upload on YouTube channels, and soon
we'll try to upload it soon.
Okay, that's good.
Thank you, everyone. And before signing off, I would also like you to know that if anyone of you is interested in joining the IEEE ISS Executive Committee, please do email us and let us know. And it will be great to have you and arrange similar talks in the future. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Jogen.
Yeah, thank you very much for arranging this.